Something just happened that should be front-page news across every outlet in America, but instead it got buried in a list of bureaucratic withdrawals that most people scrolled past without a second thought. President Trump just formally ended United States participation in the United Nations Register of Conventional Arms, cutting ties with an international framework that treats your firearms like a global security threat that needs to be monitored, cataloged, and eventually controlled. This is a big win for gun owners, a genuine victory for American sovereignty, and a direct message to the United Nations that the Second Amendment is not up for international debate. But here's what makes this infuriating. This withdrawal happened as part of a larger announcement about America pulling out of 66 different international entities, and in the flood of information about trade agreements and climate accords and international partnerships, the gun registry withdrawal got lost. Nobody's talking about it. The media isn't covering it. Gun control advocates aren't raising hell about it because they don't want you to understand what just happened. So, right now, we're going to break down exactly what the UN Register of Conventional Arms actually is, why Trump blocking the UN from accessing US gun records matters more than most people realize, and what this tells us about the long-term threat that international institutions pose to your constitutional rights. Because this isn't about some distant bureaucracy that has no impact on your life. This is about a systematic effort to normalize the idea that civilian gun ownership is a problem that requires global oversight. And the moment Americans accept that premise, the moment we treat our firearms like they're subject to international approval, the Second Amendment becomes negotiable. And that's exactly what the UN has been working toward for decades. Here's what actually happened and why the constitutional principle behind it matters so much. The Trump administration officially withdrew the United States from cooperation with the UN Arms Registry framework, specifically the reporting requirements tied to the United Nations Register of Conventional Arms. This decision was rooted in a crystal-clear constitutional stance that America does not answer to international bodies on matters involving the rights of its citizens, especially the right to keep and bear arms. By ending U.S. participation, the administration rejected the foundational premise of the UN system, which is that civilian firearms ownership is a legitimate subject for global oversight, international data collection, and foreign policy coordination. The message that withdrawal sends is unmistakable. The Second Amendment is not negotiable. It is not subject to international consensus. It is not something we're going to let the United Nations or any coalition of foreign governments weigh in on, influence, or attempt to regulate through back-channel pressure campaigns and so-called best practices that get cited by domestic lawmakers looking for cover. Americans don't get their rights from the United Nations. We don't ask permission from global bodies to exercise the freedoms our Constitution protects. And we sure as hell aren't going to let international institutions build registries, collect data, or establish frameworks that treat American gun owners like they're part of some worldwide security risk that needs to be managed by bureaucrats in Geneva. This move reinforces American sovereignty in the most direct way possible. It reaffirms that firearms policy in the United States is a domestic constitutional matter, not something that gets decided through international treaties or influenced by global norms. And it pushes back hard against the growing effort to normalize gun registries as a reasonable, responsible, common-sense step that every civilized nation should embrace. Because anyone who's studied history, anyone who understands how governments operate, knows exactly where registries lead. Registration is always the precursor to restriction. Restriction is always the precursor to control. And control is always the precursor to confiscation. That pattern has played out in every single country that went down this road, and the UN knows it, which is exactly why they're so invested in building these frameworks and getting countries to participate. For supporters of the Second Amendment, this withdrawal is not symbolic gesture politics. This is a line drawn in the sand. This is the United States government saying, we see what you're doing, we understand the long game you're playing, and we're not participating. Now, when most Americans hear the words United Nations and Small Arms Trade Treaty, their eyes glaze over. It sounds distant. It sounds bureaucratic. It sounds like something that happens in conference rooms on the other side of the world and has no relevance to your daily life, to your ability to buy a gun, to your right to defend yourself and your family. That assumption is dangerous, and it's exactly what international institutions are counting on. Because while the United Nations does not pass U.S. law, while they can't directly regulate American gun owners, they absolutely shape global norms. They run international pressure campaigns. They influence long-term policy direction. And one of the most overlooked, under-discussed mechanisms in that effort is the United Nations Register of Conventional Arms, which most people have never even heard of. This registry was established back in 1991 with a stated goal that sounded completely benign on its face: promoting transparency in global arms transfers. Who could argue with transparency, right? Countries should know what weapons are being moved around the world. That sounds reasonable. That sounds like basic accountability. But here's what happened over time. The scope of this registry expanded. It started with major weapon systems, the kinds of things that actually do pose international security concerns: tanks, fighter jets, artillery, military hardware. But then it crept into small arms and light weapons, the very category that includes firearms owned by civilians. And once that expansion happened, once the UN started treating civilian firearms as part of the international arms control conversation, the entire framework shifted. Now, you're not just talking about militaries and governments. You're talking about individual gun owners, about the firearms people keep in their homes for protection, about the rifles and shotguns hunters use, about the handguns Americans carry for self-defense. Under the UN system, member states are encouraged, not required, but strongly encouraged, to report imports and exports of small arms, to disclose national holdings, to track transfers of firearms. And here's the key issue that gets lost in all the diplomatic language and policy jargon. Once firearms are treated as an international regulatory concern, once they're framed as something that requires global coordination and oversight, civilian ownership is no longer viewed as a protected right. It's viewed as a controllable risk factor. It's something that needs to be monitored, managed, potentially restricted for the greater good of international security. That worldview is fundamentally incompatible with the American constitutional model, and it's worth taking a moment to understand why. The Second Amendment is not a privilege granted by government. It's not something the state gives you and can take away whenever they decide the calculus has changed. It's a pre-existing individual, right? Something the founders recognized as essential to ensuring that the people remain the ultimate check on power. The entire structure of the Constitution is built on the premise that government serves at the consent of the governed, and an armed population is the final guarantee that government can't turn tyrannical without facing consequences. The UN framework operates on the opposite premise. In their system, firearms are a public safety liability. Civilian ownership must be monitored, regulated, and in many cases, removed entirely. And registries are presented as a prerequisite to responsible control, as the bare minimum that any reasonable society should implement to keep people safe. These assumptions are not just different from the American model, they're the inverse of it. The founders did not see arms as something the government should track. They saw them as something the people must possess independently of government permission, of government knowledge, of government oversight. And history, both foreign and domestic, shows a consistent, undeniable pattern. Registration leads to restriction. Restriction leads to confiscation every single time. There is not one example in modern history where a government built a comprehensive gun registry and then just left it sitting there unused. The registry always becomes the tool for the next phase of control, and the United Nations doesn't need to confiscate anything directly. They don't need to send troops to collect firearms or enforce global disarmament. All they need to do is normalize the idea that registration is reasonable and international oversight is necessary. Once that framework is accepted, once countries and populations start treating civilian arms as negotiable, domestic actors take over. Agencies cite international standards, legislators point to global best practices, courts reference treaties and UN resolutions. And suddenly, you're living in a country where your rights are being redefined based on what a bunch of foreign bureaucrats decided was acceptable. That's how global governance works. That's how international pressure campaigns function. It's pressure without votes. It's influence without accountability. And the UN Register of Conventional Arms does not exist in isolation. It feeds directly into the logic of the Arms Trade Treaty, which seeks to regulate the global flow of conventional weapons, including small arms. Now, even though the US Senate has never ratified that treaty, even though it has no legal force in the United States, its language and its principles show up everywhere. They appear in regulatory proposals from executive agencies. They get cited by advocacy groups pushing for domestic gun control. They influence the way international organizations talk about firearms policy. In other words, non-binding does not mean non-impactful. The Arms Trade Treaty and the UN Registry create an ecosystem of ideas, a framework that treats gun ownership as something governments should control together, and that ecosystem seeps into domestic policy debates whether Americans realize it or not. As we move through 2026, as America approaches its 250th anniversary, the ideological divide is no longer subtle. One side believes rights come from government and can be redefined based on modern needs, contemporary values, or international consensus. The other side understands that rights come from God, that they pre-existed government, that they're merely protected by law, not granted by it. The UN Register reflects a worldview where sovereignty is secondary, where individual rights yield to global consensus, where civilian gun ownership is a problem to be managed through international coordination. And that worldview is completely alien to the American experiment. James Madison wrote that the advantage of being armed forms a barrier against the enterprises of ambition, more so than any written constitution could. International registries erase that barrier, not overnight, not with a single dramatic act, but incrementally, year by year, as the idea of gun ownership shifts from a right to a privilege, from something you possess independently to something you're granted conditionally. The threat to the Second Amendment today is not just domestic legislation, although that's real and it's constant. The deeper threat is ideological drift fueled by international institutions that do not recognize natural rights, only permissions. We are the only country on the globe that structures our relationship with government this way. We're the only nation that treats individual rights as pre-existing and inalienable rather than as grants from the state that can be revised or revoked. And the United Nations, along with most of the international community, operates on a completely different foundation. They don't understand the Second Amendment, they don't respect it, and they sure as hell don't think civilians should have access to firearms without comprehensive government tracking and control. The UN Register of Conventional Arms is not about transparency, no matter what the official documents claim. It's about conditioning the world to accept civilian disarmament as normal, as the default, as the only responsible path forward for modern societies. And Americans, more than any people on Earth, should know exactly where that road leads. We've seen it play out in countries that trusted their governments, that handed over their firearms, that accepted registration because it seemed reasonable at the time. Australia, the UK, Canada, New Zealand. Countries that once had strong gun cultures and now have populations that are completely dependent on the state for protection, with no ability to resist if that state decides to overstep its authority. That's not a future Americans should accept. That's not a future the founders would have tolerated for a second. And that's exactly why Trump's withdrawal from the UN Arms Registry matters so much. Now, here's what makes this both a victory and a warning. Trump withdrew the United States from this registry during his first term as well. He made it clear back then that America would not participate in international frameworks that treat the Second Amendment like it's negotiable. But when Biden took office, he reversed that decision. He brought the U.S. back into compliance with UN reporting requirements. He signaled to the international community that the previous administration's stance was an aberration, that America was back on board with global norms around firearms regulation, and now Trump has withdrawn us again. So what happens in 4 years or 8 years when the next administration takes power? What happens if the next president decides that international cooperation is more important than constitutional principle? They can reverse this withdrawal with the stroke of a pen. They can bring the United States back into the UN Arms Registry framework without asking Congress, without consulting the American people, without any real check on their authority. That's the vulnerability here. Presidential actions can be undone by the next president. Executive decisions don't have the permanence of legislation or constitutional amendments. And as long as the Senate has not formally rejected the Arms Trade Treaty, as long as there's no binding legislative prohibition on U.S. participation in these international frameworks, future administrations can slide us right back into compliance whenever they think the political moment is right. The Senate has never voted to adopt the Arms Trade Treaty. That's important. That's a structural protection that matters, but it's not enough. Because executive agencies can still operate within the spirit of these international agreements even without formal ratification. They can adopt regulations that mirror UN standards. They can cite international best practices in rulemaking. They can coordinate with foreign governments on firearms tracking and data sharing without ever putting it to a vote. So while Trump's withdrawal is absolutely a win, while it's worth acknowledging and celebrating as a genuine victory for gun owners and for American sovereignty, it's also a reminder of how fragile these protections can be. The fight doesn't end because one administration did the right thing. The fight continues because the next administration might reverse it, because the international pressure never stops, because the UN and its member states are playing a long game that spans decades, and they're willing to wait out temporary setbacks. What gun owners need to understand is that this is not just about one registry or one treaty or one set of reporting requirements. This is about a fundamental ideological conflict between two visions of how societies should be organized. On one side, you have the American constitutional model that treats individuals as sovereign, that recognizes natural rights, that sees government as a servant of the people rather than their master. On the other side, you have the international consensus model that treats governments as the primary actors, that views individual rights as contingent and negotiable, that sees civilian gun ownership as an outdated relic of a more primitive time. The UN is not going to give up on that vision. They're not going to wake up one day and decide that actually, the Americans were right. People should be armed, governments should be limited, and individual liberty should take precedence over collective security. That's never going to happen. So the pressure will continue. The registries will be proposed again. The treaties will be refined and reintroduced. The international frameworks will be adjusted and expanded, and every single time an American administration shows weakness, every single time a president signals that they're more concerned with international approval than constitutional fidelity, these mechanisms will creep back into our policy landscape. That's why vigilance matters more than celebration. That's why understanding what just happened is more important than simply enjoying the win. Trump blocked the UN from accessing U.S. gun records, and that's genuinely significant. That's a meaningful action that protects American gun owners from having their firearms tracked and cataloged by an international body that does not recognize their rights. But it's also a temporary protection that can be reversed the moment political winds shift. And the only way to make it permanent is for Americans to stay engaged, to stay informed, to understand the mechanisms through which international institutions try to influence domestic policy, and to hold every single administration accountable for protecting constitutional rights against global pressure. The Second Amendment is not a relic. It's not outdated. It's not something that needs to be revised to fit modern sensibilities or international norms. It's the cornerstone of American liberty, the final check against government tyranny, and the clearest expression of the founders' understanding that power ultimately rests with the people, not the state. International institutions that don't recognize that truth, that treat civilian disarmament as a policy goal rather than a fundamental violation of human rights, are not partners in protecting freedom. They're threats to it. And every time an American administration stands up to that pressure, every time a president says, "We're not participating in your frameworks, we're not reporting our data to your registries, we're not treating our citizens' rights like they're subject to your approval," that's a victory worth recognizing. Trump just drew that line again. He told the United Nations that American gun owners are not their concern, that the Second Amendment is not negotiable, that U.S. firearms policy is a domestic matter rooted in constitutional principle, not international consensus. That's exactly the stance every American president should take. That's exactly the message that needs to be sent, repeatedly and forcefully, until the international community finally understands that the American model is different and we're not changing it to make them comfortable. So yes, this is a win. This is good news. This is something that flew under the radar but deserves attention, celebration, and recognition. But it's also a reminder that the fight never ends, that the threats to our rights come from multiple directions, and that vigilance is the price of liberty. Stay informed, stay engaged, and never assume that a victory today means the battle is over, because the people who want to control you, whether they're domestic politicians or international bureaucrats, are always working on the next move.